The day we laid my son in the ground was the day his wife told me I was no longer welcome in his home. I had barely taken off my black dress when my daughter-in-law opened the front door of the house my son had loved, looked me square in the eye, and told me it was time for me to go. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't cry. She just pulled a small rolling suitcase from the front closet, the one I'd left there during the funeral arrangements, and set it on the porch like it was a package that needed returning. "This is my house now, Opal," she said. "You should go home." What she didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that the grieving old woman she was showing to the door had spent the last 30 years quietly building the health system where she worked. And sooner or later, she was going to walk into a boardroom and find me sitting at the head of the table. If you've ever been the kind of person people underestimate, you already know what I'm talking about. And if this story already speaks to something in your chest, I'd love to know where you're watching from today and what time it is where you are. Sometimes knowing someone out there is listening makes carrying a heavy story a little easier. My name is Opal Mercer. I'm 67 years old. I live in a small brick house in Germantown, Tennessee, just outside Memphis. I drive a 2013 Buick. I garden on weekends and I buy my groceries at the same Kroger I've been going to for 20 years. If you passed me on the street, you'd probably think I was somebody's retired grandmother, which, technically, I was supposed to be by now if things had gone differently. But things didn't go differently. They went the way life sometimes goes when it decides to test everything you thought you knew about yourself. I became a widow when I was 34 years old. My husband passed from a heart attack he never saw coming, and neither did I. He was 40 years old. We had a 7-year-old son named Jonah, a mortgage we were barely keeping up with, and about $11,000 in a savings account. That was the whole of it. I remember sitting at the kitchen table after the funeral, after everyone had gone home, and the casseroles were stacked in the refrigerator, and the house was quiet in a way I hadn't known quiet could feel. Jonah was asleep down the hall, and I sat there and I thought, I can fall apart, or I can figure this out. Not forever, just tonight, just figure out tonight. That became the way I did everything for the next several years. Just figure out tonight. I had a background in healthcare administration. I'd been working part-time in hospital billing when my husband passed. I went back full-time the next week. A few years later, I started consulting on the side for smaller clinics that were struggling with their billing systems and compliance reviews. I was good at it, not because I was the smartest person in the room, but because I paid attention. I listened. I remembered things, and I wasn't afraid to ask the questions that made other people uncomfortable. By the time Jonah was in middle school, I had formed my own healthcare management company, Mercer Health Partners. We started with 3 employees and 1 client. Over the years, we grew. We acquired management contracts with a network of urgent care facilities and outpatient centers across 4 states. We didn't do anything dramatic. We just did good work, quietly, consistently for a long time. I never changed my lifestyle much. Jonah grew up knowing I worked hard, but I made sure he never felt that the work came before him. We had dinner together every night I was in town. We talked about school, about the world, about what kind of man he wanted to be. And the man he became was extraordinary. Jonah was an emergency room physician. He had graduated near the top of his class at Vanderbilt Medical School and done his residency at a Level I trauma center in Nashville. He chose emergency medicine because, as he told me once, it was the place where people needed help the most and had the least time to wait for it. He loved the work. He was the kind of doctor who remembered his patients' names, who wrote notes on charts that read like he actually knew the person lying in that bed. I couldn't have been prouder of him if I'd tried. When Jonah was 35, he met his wife at a hospital system leadership conference in Atlanta. She was in healthcare administration, a director of patient services at one of the larger hospital networks in Memphis. She was impressive in the way certain people are impressive from the moment they walk into a room. Polished, confident, always saying exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. She was 32 and she had her whole future mapped out in her head. I remember the first dinner I had with them both. She brought wine and complimented my garden and asked thoughtful questions about Jonah's childhood. She was warm. She was engaging. And within 20 minutes, she had asked me, very naturally, very professionally, what kind of investments I had made over the years, because she was always trying to learn from people who had built something real. I smiled and gave her a vague answer. I had been in business long enough to know that the way someone first asks about your money tells you something important about them. But Jonah was happy, and that mattered more than my instincts. They married the following spring, a small ceremony, just family and close friends, at a botanical garden outside the city. Jonah cried a little when she walked down the aisle. I sat in the front row and told myself that whatever I had noticed could wait. For a while, things looked good from the outside. They bought a house in East Memphis. A beautiful craftsman with a wide front porch and a backyard. Jonah immediately started talking about turning into a garden. My daughter-in-law's career continued to climb. She received a promotion within the first year of their marriage. Jonah threw her a celebration dinner and was genuinely proud of her. But I began to notice things. Small things at first, the way my daughter-in-law talked about money. Not as a means but as a measure. The way she sometimes looked at Jonah when he talked about staying late for a patient or turning down a higher-paying position because he didn't want to leave his team. There was something in her expression at those moments, not anger, not quite frustration, more like recalculation. She asked about my company often, not directly. She framed her questions as professional curiosity. What was my management structure? How had I handled growth? What was the ownership arrangement with our partner facilities? I kept my answers vague. Years ago, I had learned that certain kinds of questions deserve careful answers. What she never knew, what I saw no reason to tell her, was that one of the hospital networks under Mercer Health Partners' management portfolio included the system where she had been building her career for the past several years. It wasn't the reason I had acquired that contract. It was simply the way things had fallen out. We had taken on a management agreement with Hartwell Health System 6 years earlier when its board was looking for outside help stabilizing operations. By the time my daughter-in-law accepted her position there, Mercer Health Partners had been part of that system's administrative structure for almost 3 years. She had no idea, and I saw no reason to make it an issue. It was at that point just a strange coincidence in a world where the healthcare industry in a mid-sized city is smaller than people think. But then Jonah died. He was driving home from a late shift when the accident happened. A driver ran a red light on Poplar Avenue at 2 in the morning, and Jonah never made it home. He was 40 years old. I got the call from the hospital, the same hospital where he had worked for 7 years. The doctor on the other end of the line was someone who had worked alongside my son for years, and I could hear in his voice how much he didn't want to be making that call. I remember the way the kitchen floor felt cold under my feet. I remember the silence of my house. I drove to the hospital in the dark. When I arrived, my daughter-in-law was already there. She looked pale and hollow. I walked to her and held her, and for that moment, whatever complicated feelings I carried about her disappeared. She was a woman who had just lost her husband. So was I in a different way, and grief is bigger than all of it. The funeral was 3 days later. Jonah's colleagues came. His medical school friends drove in from other cities. Some of his patients sent flowers. The man had touched so many lives in so short a time. At the service, his attending physician from residency said that Jonah Mercer was the kind of doctor that young residents became doctors because of. I stood at the front of that church, and I could barely hold myself together. My daughter-in-law cried. She accepted every hug. She said all the right things to all the right people. But I noticed, during the reception at the house afterward, that she excused herself 3 separate times to take phone calls. Each time she stepped away, she lowered her voice and turned toward the corner. At one point, I caught a few words through the hallway. "Transfer timeline," she said quietly. Yes, as soon as it clears. I told myself grief makes people strange. I told myself she was managing the chaos the only way she knew how. 2 days after the funeral, I returned to the house to help go through some of Jonah's things. I'd brought a box of photographs from his childhood. School pictures, a shot of the two of us at the Grand Canyon when he was 12, a photo of him in his first white coat. I thought she might want them. She met me at the door. She didn't invite me inside right away. "I've been meaning to talk to you," she said. I waited. "I know this is hard," she continued, and her voice was careful and measured in the way it sometimes got when she was preparing to say something she had already rehearsed. "But I think it's best if we give each other some space going forward." I looked at her. "Space," I said. "This house is mine now." She didn't say it cruelly. She said it the way someone reads a line from a legal document. And I need to be able to move forward without it feeling like everything is frozen. I said quietly that I understood, that I wasn't asking to move in, that I had only come to bring photographs of her late husband. She glanced at the box. "You can keep those," she said. "I have my own memories." I stood there for a moment looking at the woman my son had loved, and I felt something shift inside me that I don't entirely have words for. Not rage. Not even surprise, really. Something colder and clearer. Like finally understanding a sentence you had been reading wrong for years. She went back inside. She came back a moment later with my suitcase, the small one I had left in the front hall during the days of funeral arrangements, and she set it on the porch. "It would be better if you didn't come by again," she said. And then she closed the door. I stood on that porch for a long time. Long enough for a neighbor to drive past and slow down, probably wondering what was happening. Long enough for the afternoon light to shift. I looked at that closed door and I thought about the woman on the other side of it, and I thought about my son who had loved her, and I thought, she has no idea. That night I called my attorney. His name is Harold Webb, and he has handled my business affairs for the better part of 15 years. He is a careful man, deliberate and thorough, and when I told him what I needed, he didn't ask unnecessary questions. He began pulling documents, estate records, insurance policies, property titles, account transfers, the timeline of what had been filed since Jonah's death. He called me back the next morning. "Opal," he said, "several financial documents were filed within 48 hours of Jonah's passing." 48 hours. "The life insurance policy was the primary one," Harold continued. "That amount was doubled approximately 6 weeks before his death." I sat very still. "Doubled," I said. "Yes, both signatures are present on the updated policy." I looked out the window at my garden. The October light was low and gold across the yard. "Harold," I said, "is there any possibility some of those transfer documents were prepared before Jonah died?" There was a pause. I'd need to examine the filing records more carefully, but the speed of the filings is unusual. I told him to keep looking, and then I called Jonah's colleague, a woman named Carmen, who had been his closest friend in the department for years. She came to my house that afternoon, still in her scrubs, and she held my hands across the kitchen table and cried with me for a while before either of us could speak about anything practical. Then she told me something that has stayed with me ever since. About 4 weeks before the accident, Jonah had asked her if she knew a good estate attorney. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. But he'd also said something that stuck with her. He had said, "Sometimes you don't really understand what someone values until you watch what they do with money." 4 weeks before he died. I drove to Jonah's office at the hospital a few days later. Carmen let me in. His desk looked the way I imagine he had left it. Organized but lived in, with a coffee mug he'd never rinsed out and a stack of patient follow-up notes beside his keyboard. On the corner of the desk was a small legal pad. Most of it was medical notes, dosages, test results, shorthand I didn't fully understand. But near the back, in Jonah's careful handwriting, there were a few lines that had nothing to do with medicine. "Review estate docs before end of month. Call Addie Ree, property arrangement. Need to make this right before it goes further." I read those lines 3 times standing there in that quiet office. Then I carefully tore the page from the pad and put it in my bag. Harold confirmed the rest a few days later. Jonah had made an appointment with an estate attorney 3 weeks before his death. The appointment had been canceled, not by the attorney's office, but by Jonah himself the day before it was scheduled. Why, we would never know for certain, but the picture that was assembling itself was one I couldn't ignore. My son had been preparing to change something, and whatever that change was, it had never happened. And now everything had transferred exactly as it had been before he made those notes, exactly as it had been before he thought about making things right. It was around this time that I received a routine update from Mercer Health Partners operations team, the kind of monthly report I usually skim quickly and file. But this one I read more carefully. It included a personnel summary from Hartwell Health System, a list of employees being considered for promotion. My daughter-in-law's name was on the list. She was being reviewed for a vice president of clinical operations position. The review was scheduled for the following month. I read the entry twice, then I sat back in my chair. I called the executive director at Hartwell, a man named Bernard who had worked with our management team for years. I had never discussed my personal life with Bernard. He was professional, measured, and exactly the kind of person I needed to speak to right now. I told him I needed to schedule a formal governance review, a senior leadership meeting. I asked him to include my daughter-in-law's promotion file in the agenda. Bernard asked me if I was sure. I told him yes. The meeting was set for a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later. I arrived at Hartwell Health System's administrative building at 8:30. Bernard met me in the lobby. He looked slightly uncomfortable, which I understood. This was unusual. I had always operated quietly, at a distance, and suddenly I was physically present, about to sit in a room where a decision would be made about someone who had packed my suitcase and set it on a porch. We walked to the 4th floor conference room. The windows looked out over the parking lot, and beyond that, a line of water oaks still holding their October color. I sat at the head of the table. Bernard sat to my right. A few minutes later, the door opened. My daughter-in-law walked in carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the expression of someone who had prepared thoroughly for a promotion review. She was dressed carefully. Her posture was confident. She was ready. Then she saw me. The color drained from her face so quickly that for a moment I was genuinely concerned about her. She stopped in the doorway. Her portfolio slipped slightly in her grip. "Opal," she said. Her voice had lost every trace of its professional composure. I looked at her calmly. "Good morning," I said. She stepped into the room slowly and sat down across the table. She looked at Bernard, then back at me. "I don't understand," she said. "What is this?" Bernard spoke carefully. "This is a governance review. Mercer Health Partners holds management authority over several administrative and personnel decisions within this system. That includes senior promotions at the VP level and above." She stared at him, then at me. "You're involved in this system," she said slowly. "Mercer Health Partners has held a management contract with Hartwell since 2020, I said. "I founded Mercer Health Partners in 1991. The silence in that room was the kind you feel more than hear. My daughter-in-law set her portfolio on the table very carefully, the way a person sets something down when their hands aren't entirely steady. "I didn't know," she said. "I know you didn't." She looked at me for a long moment. Something moved across her face. Not quite guilt, not quite fear, but something that had both of those things in it. "Is that why you're here?" she asked. "Because of what happened at the house?" "I'm here," I said, "because this is where my responsibilities have always been. The timing is what it is." Bernard opened the folder in front of him. "We've been reviewing the senior promotion file. There are some internal concerns that have been flagged, workplace conduct matters." My daughter-in-law's eyes narrowed. "Conduct? I've never had a formal complaint." "There haven't been formal complaints," Bernard said. "There have been documented observations. from supervisors and colleagues. About patterns of behavior. He slid the summary across the table. She picked it up and began to read. I watched her face as she went through it. The notes about how she had positioned herself by forming certain alliances and undermining others, the documentation of how she had used personal narratives to shape perception among senior leadership, the record of how quickly she had contacted HR about her promotion review just 2 days after Jonah's funeral. 2 days. She set the document down. These are opinions, she said. They are observations, Bernard replied, documented over time. She turned to me. This is personal, you know this is personal. It may feel that way, I said. But these observations existed before Jonah died. I'm simply the person who has the authority to act on them. She leaned back. She was recalibrating. I could almost watch her mind work. What does this mean for the promotion? It's being denied, Bernard said. She turned back to me. Her voice was quieter now. Some of the composure had dropped away, and underneath it was something rawer and harder to read. You could have told me, she said, about your company, about all of it. Yes, I said. Why didn't you? I looked at her across that conference room table. This woman who had been part of my family for 5 years, who my son had loved, who had placed my suitcase on a porch while I was still wearing black. Because I wanted to know who people were without their knowing who I was, I said. And I found out. She had no answer for that. I reached into my bag and placed the legal pad page on the table between us. Jonah's handwriting, those few lines near the back of the pad. She stared at the page. For a long time she didn't say anything. Then she pressed her lips together and looked away toward the window. I didn't accuse her of anything. I didn't know, with certainty, what Jonah had been planning to change. I didn't know what had happened in that marriage in the weeks before he was taken from us. I didn't know whether she had known about his appointment with the estate attorney or whether the insurance increase had been her idea or his or both of theirs together. I would never have those answers, and sitting there in that boardroom I realized I had stopped needing them the way I had needed them a month ago. What I knew was this: my son had been thinking about something, and the woman across from me had moved very quickly, the moment he was gone, to make sure nothing changed. He was trying to figure something out, I said quietly. I think you know that. She didn't answer. I'm not here to destroy you, I continued. I'm here because this is where I've always had a responsibility, and I intend to continue doing my job. She stood without speaking for a moment, then she said very quietly, He never told me you built all of this. No, I said. He was proud of me in a way that didn't require him to announce it. She walked to the door. Before she left, she turned back one more time. I am sorry about Jonah, she said. The words sounded like they came from somewhere genuine, underneath all the rest of it. Whatever you think of me, I am sorry about that. I know, I said. And then she was gone. Bernard exhaled slowly once the door had closed. That was significant, he said. Yes, I said. I stayed in that chair for a little while longer, looking out the window at the water oaks and the October sky. The weeks that followed were quieter. Harold finished his review of the estate documents. Nothing illegal had occurred. My daughter-in-law had acted within her legal rights as Jonah's spouse. The insurance policy increase had both signatures. The asset transfers had all been properly filed. Sometimes the truth is simply what it is, and what it is isn't clean. My daughter-in-law remained in her position at Hartwell. She continued to do her work. As far as I know, she does it competently. We did not speak again after that morning in the conference room. The following spring, I established the Jonah Mercer Foundation. It provides scholarships to medical students from lower-income families across the Mid-South who want to pursue careers in emergency medicine. Every year, we award 3 full tuition scholarships and 4 stipends for living expenses. Jonah believed that medicine should reach the people who needed it most, and that the barriers keeping good people out of that work were barriers worth removing. Every time I meet the scholarship recipients, Young men and women who are nervous and determined and full of the kind of hope that hasn't been tested yet. I see pieces of my son in them. His seriousness, his gentleness. His belief that showing up for people was the most important thing you could do with a life. He was right about that. He was right about most things. Grief is a strange country. I have been living in it for over a year now, and I can tell you that it does not look the same from the inside as it does from the outside. It is quieter than you imagine and more persistent. It is the empty chair at Thanksgiving. It is reaching for your phone to call someone and remembering again that there is no one to call. It is finding an old voicemail and sitting in your car in a parking lot for 20 minutes just to hear his voice say, "Hey, Mom, just checking in, call me back." But grief also sometimes reveals things. It revealed to me how much my son had built into the world in 40 years. It revealed to me which people in my life were truly there and which ones were calculating their proximity to something I had. It revealed to me that the woman my son married had been watching me from the very first dinner, trying to map out what I was worth, and that she had never seen me at all. You don't need to raise your voice to protect what matters. You don't need a dramatic confrontation or a courtroom or a public reckoning. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply continue to be exactly who you are, in the places where your presence already counts. The quiet old woman my daughter-in-law showed to the door had been walking into that boardroom long before she ever arrived at my son's house. She just didn't know it yet. Jonah knew who I was. He used to say, when I reminded him about something I'd accomplished, "Mom, you built a whole company and you still act like you're not sure it worked out." He laughed when he said it. I laughed too. He wasn't wrong. And if there is one thing I carry from all of this into whatever years I have left, it is this. The measure of a life is not what you accumulate. It is what you leave in other people. In the work they do better because you showed them how, in the care they give because someone gave it to them first, in the small room they hold for you in their chest long after you're gone. Jonah left that in every person he ever treated in an emergency room at 2 a.m. He left it in Carmen, who still cries when she talks about him. He left it in me. That's not nothing. That's everything. If this story reached you in some way today, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? And have you ever had a moment when someone looked right past you and later had to reckon with what they missed? Leave me a comment below. I read every one of them. And if stories about resilience and truth and the quiet strength it takes to keep going speak to something in you, I hope you'll stay with this channel. There's more where this came from.